him, Karmelo, 2 or 3 other boys. And while they were in the dugout, a coach came up and told them they couldn't be here, right? So they went back out, and then this student that was on the stand, he's a minor, so I can't identify him, but he went out and started warming up for the 4x100 race. And he said Karmelo initially came out because Karmelo was an alternate to the 4x100 race that day. Then Karmelo went back in the bleachers, and he said he looked up, he saw his teammate just walking around, and so he continued to, warm up and everything. And then he saw and heard commotion under the Memorial High School tent. And he initially described it as what looked like a loose surrounding of Carmelo Anthony under the tent. So he got concerned because, like, hey, this is my teammate. Let me go see what's going on. I don't know if he has a friend up there. I don't know if it's just horse playing around. I don't know if this is serious. He says he's walking towards the bleachers, of course. He's looking back to see if his teammates see what's happening. And then, of course, he turns around for a split second, and then all of a sudden, all the students start scattering through the bleachers. And so that was his account of what goes on. Of course, that scattering coming after the stabbing. Now, once the prosecution gets up on cross-examination, the prosecutor, clearly says that him and this student had met before prior to this trial. And he got the student to admit that in this pretrial meeting that they had, they showed him that surveillance video that we also saw in court early on in this trial. And after seeing that video, the student admitted that some of his accounts or recounts of what happened were simply wrong. And so that was the big, kind of gotcha moment by the prosecution under cross-examination. And so then on redirect, the defense attorney brought up that, if I brought up to you and said that the videos on these or the timestamps on this video didn't really add up here, what would you say to that? To which the student said, I wouldn't know that information, which that was talked about early on in the trial, how these 2 different angles of this video might have been a few seconds off as far as, recounting what happened at which time. So that was important, Matt. Then we have the officer up there that talked about how having a blade under 5.5 inches isn't necessarily illegal to have at a stadium, but it's obviously against school policy. That was pretty much the crux of his testimony. Only lasted for a few minutes, Matt. And then one more student after that got up there, and it was kind of a lackluster witness because he essentially said he didn't remember anything. And then he all but said that he didn't want to be there to testify. The prosecutor asked him under cross-examination and said, you and your father have talked before. Of course, you and the defense have talked. And this student had just signed to LSU for football 2 days ago from now. And, the prosecutor was getting at, you didn't really want to be here, did you? And the kid kind of chuckled and admitted that. So those are the 3 witnesses today, Matt. 2 students and an officer. And then we go to lunch at 11:15. And we go back in, and this judge, of course, has been really prompt, laying down the law, laying down the rules, really on time. Told us to be back here at 12:30 Central Time, local time here. So we get back, it's 12:30. All right, we're not in the courtroom, 12:45. We're still not in there, 1 o'clock. 1 hour and 45 minutes later, Matt, at 2:15, we go back in that courtroom. And, of course, as we're sitting out there, all the speculations kind of, floating through everybody's head. Are they negotiating a plea deal? Is he going to testify? What is the meaning of all of this? Because this judge has been so prompt. We get back in there, we sit down for a couple of minutes, and then the defense attorney, Mike Howard, gets up and says, the defense rests. The state puts on no rebuttal. They rest. And then the judge gives, the instruction to the jury that you're going to hear closing arguments tomorrow morning, which are scheduled for tomorrow morning. They're going to get that a jury instruction. And then they're going to have the case to go back for deliberations. And they are sequestered, Matt, meaning that they aren't going home. They can deliberate as late as 10 or 11 p.m. that the judge was saying. And if they decide to call it quits, they don't come to an answer tomorrow on that verdict, they'll have to go back to a hotel nearby where, there will be no TVs, there will be no phones, so they can't, taint their minds with, before their decision-making going on in these deliberations. So kind of an abrupt resting by the defense here, Matt, and they're moving along. It's been pedal to the metal here. We've had 4 days of testimony. It only went about half a day today before each side rested. So we're on schedule to be done by the end of this week, as this judge wanted to in this trial.
Yeah, I think it's ahead of schedule, according to what our projections were and what we were hearing from all of the parties. No surprise there that the colloquy, obviously there's no cameras, isn't done in front of the jury, but it is kind of a surprise that it wasn't done in open court in front of you and the other media members and the family. So that's surprising. But from what I'm hearing you say, not only did this defendant not take the stand, but they really didn't even call witnesses that really went to the self-defense that they were promising the jury.
That's exactly right, Matt. The prosecution called over 10 student eyewitnesses from all varying different schools. The defense called some witnesses. And in fact, Matt, one of the defense's student witnesses, at the end of his testimony, a defense witness said that he believed Karmelo was in the wrong. That was just shocking to me. And that witness, along with 100% of all the other prosecution's witnesses, all said that this did not look like self-defense. They said Karmelo was the instigator, Karmelo was the aggressor. They also said, some of them did say Austin Metcalf was, getting boisterous as well. We know how boys can get. They all, these witnesses didn't expect for anybody to have a knife. Boys fight. They've been doing that for decades. No one really expected anything this detrimental to happen, but not a single student got up there, Matt, and aided to the self-defense claim.
Yeah, and then again, he didn't testify, so that's a little bit surprising in a self-defense case that we see. So you spent the weekend there, as we know. You had testimony that you covered over the weekend. How has the mood been in the community during this weekend and after the trial has been started? Bringing us to this point, we are on the eve of closings.
Absolutely. The tension has been high out here outside, Matt. I can see some of the police putting up some extra barricades. They're rolling in one of those towers with extra cameras on it because tomorrow's could possibly be verdict day. And out here this morning, we had, groups supporting each party that were out here. Obviously there's been some mouthing off. We've seen it floating around on social media, videos getting posted of these different groups out in the parking lot going at each other, but there's been no violence. People have a right to, I guess, voice their opinions across this parking lot. But inside the courtroom, Matt, you can feel the tension, but everyone's keeping things professional. No one's giving any snide looks because, of course, the judge would admonish those things. But outside in the parking lot is where most of that tension is, coming to a head out here. But again, no violence, nothing super crazy, but hopefully the security's heightened out here tomorrow because it could go either way. And I'm sure there are going to be opinions, judgments, and reactions no matter which way this verdict goes.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think we might be in a verdict watch tomorrow afternoon. Cody Thomas, thank you so much for your reporting. We'll look forward to more from you coming from that courthouse there on air and online. Let's do this. Let's bring in my guests for this hour. We have domestic violence expert, former law enforcement, still on the program, Claudia King. We have criminal defense attorney, Joanna Nieves, and civil and criminal litigator and former felony prosecutor, Eric Faddis. We're going to go ladies first, Eric. Let's first go to Joanna Nieves. Are you surprised that this defendant did not take the stand?
I think because we were anticipating that we would probably hear from him, they were kind of teeing it up with his background, and he doesn't really have so much to lose when it comes to testifying because he doesn't have any criminal history and he was a good student. He's got a supportive family. I did expect that they were actually going to put him on, but I do think that the major takeaway is that the defense felt that they elicited enough for them to argue self-defense from the witnesses that took the stand regarding the size and stature of Austin, the push that took place, however, hard it was or aggressive it was, the escalation and how rapidly everything happened. I think they're just going to make the argument that he had this reasonable fear of serious bodily injury.
Claudia King, you were former law enforcement and also a violence expert, domestic violence. The defense chose to call witnesses. It's not their burden to do so, but they called a student who really didn't move the needle, and then an officer who was helpful in terms of the knife wasn't against the law, it was against school policy, and then they had a hostile witness. But your thoughts on all of this, should they have called someone that was an expert in violence, since they were saying that the victim was provoking this attack?
Yeah, I think we definitely needed to hear more about this self-defense claim and really understand what made Karmelo Anthony feel that he needed to defend himself with deadly force. And I think what the prosecution would have done in that case is brought up the fact that self-defense is negated when you are the aggressor. And they would have asked him all these times that you were asked to leave, why didn't you? And they would have tried to paint him as the aggressor versus the one being attacked.
Former prosecutor Eric Faddis, did prosecutors prove their case?
Gosh, Matt, so far it seems like they've put forth a compelling showing as to Carmelo Anthony's guilt here. Look, they called a number of witnesses. They showed the video. They showed the jurors the video, giving them a lay of the land and an understanding of the landscape. And then they called forensic folks. They called police folks. They called witnesses. They called people who observed what happened and who heard the verbal exchanges between these two. And all of those folks were pretty much consistent that this didn't appear to be self-defense, that it did appear to be sort of an abrupt escalation, as we've heard, but that there wasn't much evidence as to why this killing and stabbing would have been justified under these circumstances. So I think the prosecution did a good job. The defense, there are some lingering questions as to witness preparation. One of the witnesses they called said that they didn't even talk to defense counsel. I can't imagine why that would be unless the witness was refusing to talk with them. That's sort of, homicide prep 101. You got to have a conversation with these witnesses. You got to know what they're going to say on the stand. Sounds like some of that testimony might have even been surprising to defense.
We have a power panel on the show tonight for our special coverage. You're all going to be sticking with me all hour long. Thank you for that. Coming up, we do have to take a break. We're going to take a look at the prosecution's case. Also, let us know what you think about this case on social media. And you can also find more reporting on courttv.com. Welcome back to Court TV Live. Karmelo Anthony's defense argued that Anthony was merely protecting himself and acting in self-defense, but prosecutors paint a very different picture, calling it a senseless murder. Let's take a look back at the prosecution's opening and how they describe the incident. Remember, no cameras. Here's some quotes from the courtroom. This is what they had to say during their opening statement. Quote, "We are all here because Karmelo Anthony decided to take a knife to a high school track meet and provoke another young man who he didn't know into touching him, holding an already opened knife in his hand and plunging it into his heart. The defendant decided to commit an unjustified, provoked murder. This case was nothing to do with race. This is not self-defense." Now, according to prosecution, this is how they say that the incident happened. This is what they told the jury. Austin Metcalf and the team were under their school tent at the track meet. Defendant Karmelo Anthony went under Metcalf's team tent during bad weather. Metcalf asked Anthony to leave, prompting a fight where Anthony stabbed Metcalf. Let's bring in domestic violence expert, former law enforcement officer Claudia King, criminal defense attorney Joanna Nieves, and civil and criminal litigator and former felony prosecutor Eric Faddis. Eric, this is the prosecution's case and their timeline. What'd you think?
Pretty solid, Matt. You know, I think they kind of established these themes, right? So, like, they're arguing Karmelo Anthony shouldn't have been in that tent. It was another team's tent. He shouldn't have been there. Karmelo Anthony shouldn't have had a knife at a high school track fight. That's crazy. What are you doing? Karmelo Anthony shouldn't have stabbed. There was just not justification, legal, moral, or otherwise, according to the prosecution. And then they're arguing that Karmelo Anthony fled from that scene. And what they did was that they had evidence to back that up. They paraded in a number of witnesses over the course of days who really supported those themes. And so if the jury accepts that, I think that is a compelling case against Karmelo Anthony here. And then, you know, the defense did some stuff too.
Claudia King, what do you think that the prosecutors will lean into with their closing remarks tomorrow?
I think they're going to lean into the fact that this was not self-defense. They're going to lean into the fact that Karmelo Anthony was the aggressor. He was in a place where he should not have been. He was asked to leave multiple times and did not, thus negating any ability to claim self-defense.
Joanna Nieves, there are no winners here. It is tragedy all the way around, and so many lives impacted by this incident in question. Also, the community has not been able to heal. There are barricades around the courthouse, and it's growing from that number initially of barricades, according to our reporting there at the courthouse with Cody Thomas. Joanna, do you think that they should have allowed cameras in this one?
I would have loved if they allowed cameras in this one. I do think they should have, but I know that we're dealing with a lot of underage witnesses. The defendant himself is underage, and so, well, he was at the time that it happened. But from what I understand, there were a number of people who they were likely interested in protecting their interests and the exposure to all of this kind of public scrutiny that's been happening. And it's just a very volatile set of circumstances. You know, you have strong feelings on either side of the table, and, you know, there's a tragic loss of a young child's life. And then another person who was just 17 at the time that all of this happened is now standing trial for those events. And I think that's just one thing that we can't lose sight of, that Karmelo Anthony was 17 years old. And I know that everybody is upset about the fact that he had a knife and that was against policy. But, you know, it's a utility knife that many people carry. It's not illegal. And I don't actually believe that he woke up with the intent of murdering somebody that day, or even pulled that knife out with the intent of murdering someone. And that is likely what the defense is going to lean into here, that lack of intent to kill, maybe reckless behavior, but not, or of course they're going to argue self-defense. But I think that some jury members may actually struggle with intent.
All right, panel, stand by. Let's now talk about some key evidence in the case. As we know, Court TV anchor Cody Thomas was in the courtroom during this 4-day trial. And when the state presented footage of the stabbing, it was grainy at times and hard to see. They also called several key witnesses, including coaches and students. Here is what Heritage High School football coach Vincent Hooper told the jury, quote, "I put my arm around him and asked, quote, 'What did you do?' He said that he put his hands on me. I said, 'You know, if he dies, you just change the rest of your life.' Karmelo then said, 'He's not going to die.' And then I said, 'What if he does?' Karmelo then started crying." Under cross-examination, this witness said, "I don't think that Karmelo actually thought that the victim would die. He was crying. I do believe his emotions were genuine. Karmelo did not try to run from me." Let's bring back the guests to talk about this, the power panel. Claudia King, your thoughts?
You know, I did find it interesting that the first thing he said was he put his hands on me. It didn't express fear for his life or fear for injury. But I do think his emotion was genuine at that moment. And maybe he didn't think that the victim was going to die. But what he did registered in that moment. And he realized he possibly did change the rest of his life with that one action.
Joanna Nieves, what sticks out to you?
I think what sticks out to me is that concept of, he was not really thinking about, I'm going to kill this person. I want to kill this person. I'm pulling this knife out to intentionally kill them, but rather, he's shocked by the concept of, oh, whoa, this person could actually die by that action. And so it just speaks to that argument that I think that the defense really needs to attack that element of intent to kill as they start speaking to the jury.
Eric Faddis, your turn.
If I'm defense counsel, I'm going to highlight this interaction in closing argument because I think it shows, a really honest and somewhat innocent exchange between this minor at the time. He's scared, he's tearful, he's confused, he doesn't exactly know what happened or what the result is going to be. He's confiding in his coach, and I think that is really the feeling that the defense wants to convey to this jury. That this was, a young 17-year-old dude, scared, wasn't sure exactly what was going on. And that is more consistent with self-defense than it is with some sort of villainous killing.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see those closing remarks tomorrow. Let's do this. Let's get in a short break. And when we come back, we are going to talk about the defense case in all of this and some of the key testimony from their side and this incident. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice.
everyone deserves the same rights under the law that everyone is afforded to.
When self-defense is raised by the facts, the law puts the burden squarely on the prosecution.
I decree, Karmelo Anthony will walk free.
He could have gotten out of the tent in no time. It's not like he's cornered in a area in an alleyway.
When someone is allegedly pushed or touched, I just want to see if the law will be applied in the same way it's been applied in other cases.
Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Matt Johnson in for Cody Thomas. Thanks for being with us. The defense rested its case in chief without calling the defendant, Karmelo Anthony, to the stand. Closing arguments are expected tomorrow morning. So now let's take a look back at the defense's case in chief. Here's what they had to say during their opening statements. Remember, no cameras in the courtroom. Quote, self-defense is useless if you wait until it's too late. In that moment, when Austin makes the first physical contact, he reacts in a split second of fear and chaos. Well, why didn't they just walk away is the question. The answer there, after Melo defended himself, he ran. He didn't stab twice, drop the knife by the tent on the bleachers. Instead of running to the exit, he goes onto the tracks and walks right up to a coach and stayed until an officer arrived. This is what the defense had to say of what happened, their explanation of the incident. Austin Metcalf threatened Karmelo Anthony when he went under the tent. They said that Metcalf grabbed Anthony after being warned not to touch him. Karmelo Anthony says that he was acting in self-defense when he stabbed Metcalf. According to the defense, Austin Metcalf threatened Karmelo Anthony when he went under the tent. So let's bring back my guests here to discuss all of this. We have standing by domestic violence expert, former law enforcement Claudia King, criminal defense attorney Joanna Nieves, and civil and criminal litigator and former felony prosecutor Eric Faddis. Eric, what sticks out to the defense case for you?
Gosh, you know, one thing that's big, Matt, potentially is the physical disparity between these two. Look, Karmelo Anthony is listed at around 5'9", 130 pounds. Austin Metcalf, by contrast, is listed at around 6 feet, 225 pounds. That's a big boy. And so, you know, in Karmelo Anthony's mind, was Austin Metcalf capable of causing serious bodily injury or death to Karmelo Anthony? Probably. And as this situation is escalating and decisions are being made within a split second, you know, is that enough to convince this jury that this might have been self-defense? I think that physical disparity piece is key.
Claudia King, did you hear anything in there about self-defense that would move the needle for you? We'll work on Claudia King's signal there, but Joanna Nieves, the same question to you, my friend.
Sure, I think that what we're looking at is we don't need to confirm that Karmelo was right in his thinking. We just need to, and I'm speaking as defense, right? We need to show that he had this reasonable fear of serious bodily injury, and that is what was going through his mind in that moment. And that's quite a distinction, because I think a lot of people are looking at it after the fact and saying, whoa, you pulled out a knife and you stabbed somebody, of course they're gonna die. And that might not have been what he's thinking. He's thinking, I need to protect myself from this large person coming towards me who's already put their hands on me, and I don't know what they're going to do next. And so I do think that there is a basis for the defense to make this self-defense argument. And obviously it's up to the jury to not only determine if that was a reasonable fear, but if the reaction was and the use of force was proportionate.
Let's take a look back at the final defense witness that took the stand. A Frisco high school student had this to say on the stand for the defense. Remember, kind of a hostile witness described by Cody. Here's what he said. Track meets are very social. You can talk to somebody 30 seconds, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, on the field, on the bleachers, all over the place. And then on describing the event in question, I saw people standing up and congregating under the memorial tent. All of of a sudden I see someone get pushed or punched or something. It looked like somebody was trying to stop a fight. Going on to say the witness cannot say with certainty whether it was a push or a punch. So, Joanna, did this witness help or hurt the defense?
I think it's one of those things where it's like it doesn't give a whole lot of detail, but it does confirm that there was some action, whether it was a push or a punch. There was some physical contact that was made. And I think Eric hit the nail on the head. There's quite a disparity between these two people. Karmelo Anthony sounds like he's actually smaller than me. And if I think about a 6-foot person, 200-something pounds coming my way, I'm concerned for my safety and what that person can physically do to me. And so, especially if they've put their hands on me and I have to defend myself from further serious harm. And so, this is a really tough case. And I think, of course, I've got this bleeding heart for such a kid that is facing these serious consequences, but a life was lost, and it's just a pure tragedy.
Eric, was it a mistake not to encourage the client to testify?
Tremendous mistake. I can't fathom how that decision was made. Look, at the end of a case like this, if you're defense counsel, if you're reasonably confident that you've secured a victory with the evidence that's been presented, then maybe you tell your client, hey, sit this one out, let's give it to the jury and see what they do, because we could cause more harm than good. But that was not the case here. The defense was by no means a secure position. And I think you've got to throw the Hail Mary. You've got to have a last-ditch effort. And on top of that, Matt, what the jury has to decide is whether Karmelo Anthony had a reasonable fear of imminent serious bodily death or serious bodily injury or death. And who better can convey that than this 19-year-old Karmelo Anthony to talk about, this is what was going on in my body. I felt my blood started rushing. I felt these sensations going on, that this anxiety was escalating. And these are the things that you can convey to a jury from the defendant's mouth. And now they don't have that option.
And it's his right to testify or not, cannot be held against him. Only he can make that decision, and obviously cloaked in the presumption of innocence. But, Eric, I think we're in a world now, when I talk to jury members across the country covering these trials for Court TV, I think we're in a world where the jury really wants to hear from the defendant.
Yeah, I feel you. And I think that that's doubly true in a self-defense case. That this isn't some shoplifting case or something like that. If as defense, you're going to say, hey, jury, you got to decide whether this person had a reasonable fear of imminent bodily harm. Well, let's hear about that fear. We want to hear about what it felt like inside that defendant's body, what was going through their mind during this scary encounter for anybody. And I think Joanna makes a good point, too, that the jury doesn't necessarily have to decide whether this was self-defense. The jury has to decide whether there's a reasonable doubt as to if this was self-defense. And that's a much lower threshold. That's a much more nuanced inquiry. And so, I'll be interested to see what direction both sides go during closings.
Yeah, Claudia King, you're back in the mix. Thank you. We are talking about the fact that this defendant decided not to take the stand. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I do think that we needed to hear from him, because when you are talking about self-defense, you want to hear from that person who truly experienced it, especially when the other witnesses didn't really give a good picture or a good indication of that self-defense. So I think to keep going with the self-defense, we needed to hear from Karmelo Anthony and hear about what he felt in those moments.
Yeah, Joanna, I want to get your thoughts on him not taking the stand again, but also, I thought that they did a really good job of kind of explaining whether, which was to their benefit, of, being a reason why he may have been under the other team's tent, and then also track culture, which is important to understand for the setting.
Yeah, it brings people into like what's going on at that time. And even though the video was grainy also, I think just being able to see kind of like where things are set up and having a visual for them about placement helps the jury kind of get a good understanding of the environment and how things took place and unfolded. But as far as him not testifying, I would definitely say that I think it was a fumble for the defense. And I imagine that maybe it came down to either Carmelo was really, really nervous to take the stand. I mean, it is a difficult thing for anybody to do, but maybe the idea of him not being able to withstand the pressure of the prosecution's inquiries, especially when it came down to questions like, why did you have that knife? You knew you weren't supposed to have it. Why would you bring it to a track meet? I think that even though he may have been able to give us the insight we really wanted to hear about what was going on in his mind, maybe they felt that he would not have withstood the prosecution's pressure.
Do you think that the jury gets the case tomorrow, Joanna?
Yes, absolutely. I think, they're going to get through jury instructions relatively quickly once closing arguments are over, and the jury will have the case by the afternoon.
All right, and Claudia, do you think that do you think it's a good idea that they are going to be sequestered during deliberations? I was saying all along, maybe they should have been sequestered for the duration of the trial and allow cameras in.
I agree with both of those things. I think a lot of what we're seeing on social media is because people don't know what's going on inside that courtroom and they're getting second and third hand information like the telephone game. As far as the sequestration, I think they should have been sequestered the entire time. This is better than nothing. At least they will be able to deliberate and get to a verdict ideally without any outside pressure.
And it could be a verdict Tuesday night, Eric Faddis, but your thoughts on sequestration?
Yeah, I mean, I think this case could have been treated just like any other big nationally publicized case. I'm not sure, sequestration was even totally appropriate. That being said, there have been some purported outside influences, or at least outside activities going on. We can see from those shots outside the courthouse that there's a lot of stuff going on out there. And there is at least a concern that those sorts of dynamics can influence what a jury might do. And, when those jurors are making that final decision in that deliberation room, are they going to think to themselves, hey, if I vote one way or the other, what's going to happen to my community? What's going to happen outside this courthouse? And sometimes sequestration can try to assuage some of those risks.
All right, we are going to have to put a pin in the discussion right there. Thank you so much to everyone on the panel. Coming up, more out of the Texas courthouse in the murder case of Karmelo Anthony. This is Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice.
To the family who experienced the loss, my heart truly goes out to you. To those who have supported my family, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We ask for your continued support, patience, and prayers as we navigate this difficult process. Thank you.
Deliberations will begin tomorrow. After closing arguments are delivered in the case, Judge John Roach warned jurors could be sequestered in a hotel with no access to phones, television, or the outside world once deliberations begin. Before the jury gets the case, however, we want to break down evidence in the trial connected to the big question, self-defense or not. The defendant did not take the stand, did not testify in his own defense, but the jury did hear Karmelo's voice on body-worn camera that was presented during evidence. This is what he had to say, quote, "I'm not alleged, I did it. He put his hands on me, I told him not to." Karmelo, crying hysterically, said, "He put his hands on me. I told him not to. He put his hands on me." Let's bring back my guest, domestic violence expert and former law enforcement officer Claudia King, criminal defense attorney Joanna Nieves, and civil and criminal litigator and former felony prosecutor Eric Faddis. Claudia King, to you first. What'd you hear?
I heard an excuse, to be honest with you. Again, I think if you were truly in fear for your life, that's what you would say. That would be the first thing coming out of your mouth, that I was scared. I thought he was going to hurt me. I thought he was going to kill me. And instead it was just, he put his hands on me. So I think that is a problem for this defense and for this defendant. And I think the prosecution is going to harp on that to show this is not self-defense.
Joanna, your thoughts?
I agree with Claudia that this isn't the best statement. There are others that I think are more compelling regarding his, concern for Austin and the questions he asked and actions that he took. But this one here, obviously, as a defense attorney, we would have wanted it framed differently, but I don't think it necessarily indicates that he intended to kill Austin. I think he's just saying, like, here's what prompted this situation. This rapidly escalated, and I responded.
Eric Faddis, is that the biggest piece of evidence for prosecutors?
What piece? That statement just there?
Yes. The statement of admitting.
For me, it's consistent with self-defense in a way. What I mean is that what is self-defense? Self-defense is when someone else is aggressing upon you and then they get physically violent with you and you defend yourself. Isn't that basically what he said? He's saying, hey, this other guy put his hands on me first. And that is how self-defense plays out. This other person was the initial aggressor. That is a central component to self-defense. And so I think in some ways it's consistent with self-defense.
And it seemed like a lot of people were confused that took the stand, including some of the witnesses. I want to take a look at another student's defense witness testimony about what he said happened. The Centennial High School student said this about the incident: "It could have been people just messing around. It could be something serious. But at the time, it struck me enough as something could be wrong." Claudia King, it seemed like there was a lot of confusion.
Absolutely, there was a lot of confusion, and I think that does help the defense, because do we really have the intent to kill? And that I'm not so sure about. Now, I know that it only takes that split second to frame that intent, but because of the confusion, that does play in favor of the defense.
And this witness went on to say, Joanna, I saw a push, I saw arms go out, but he couldn't tell whether or not it was contact and who touched who at first. The confusion, how does it play? Who does it hurt and help?
I think what we're hearing kind of consistently across the board is that there was some type of approach by Austin and there was some type of contact. We don't know the extent. From the reporting, it sounds like some people said a push, some people said kind of like a linebacker movement, which I don't know sports, so I can't even really indicate what that was. But I would say that across, it does indicate that there was some sort of aggressive movement towards Karmelo that he was responding to. And like Eric mentioned, that is actually what the self-defense is centered around. Like, did he have a fear that something was going to happen to him that could cause serious bodily injury? And is that the reason he responded the way he did?
And Eric Vettis, there were school officials that testified about the knife on campus. Resource officers said, quote, "The thing that most shocked me was that a student brought a knife to a track meet. Cortez agrees that this was unprecedented. Not allowed on school campus, those knives, but it wasn't against the law." And again, we go back to the fact that the defendant didn't take the stand and explain why he had a knife in his bag.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of like, so what? Like this, it's not illegal to have a knife, and we don't know what this kid's background is. We don't know what threats he may have faced throughout his life. We don't know what he was scared of. We don't know if he had any enemies. We don't know a lot of these things. And if he would have testified, perhaps we would have. But that being said, as a juror, I can't conclude that some guy bringing a way to protect himself to this track meet where there's going to be opponents, there's going to be heightened emotions, there's going to be a lot going on. Who cares that he brought a knife? That part just does not resonate with me. And looking at this from prosecutorial standpoint, I think he was totally allowed legally to have the knife. And so what if he had it? Now, something horrible happened later on, but the fact that he brought it there, that part is not particularly damning at all to me.
Yeah, Claudia King, you know, I just think that there are a lot of questions surrounding this case that the community might still have, including, you know, since there are no cameras, you know, no explanation really why the knife was there, whether it's legal or not legal to carry it.
I agree with you, and I think that's why we really did need cameras in the courtroom, because these questions now are going to linger. And just like it was said earlier, they're lingering as well because we didn't hear anything from the defendant. So some of these questions could have been answered, at least for the jury. But I do find it troubling, and I think that we're going to continue to experience this social media and public outrage because the facts just aren't there and people are making assumptions because they don't know what the testimony was.
Yeah, and Joanna, when we talk about that jury that is going to be entering deliberations tomorrow after the jury is sworn in and the deliberating jury is chosen, what we do know is from Cody Thomas's notes from within the courtroom, here is what appears to be the makeup of this jury. Hearing case evidence: majority white, 3 Asian women, 1 Middle Eastern woman, 1 other woman of color, and all the men appear to be white Caucasian. So do you think that that plays a factor in this case, Joanna, and why?
Yeah, I've touched on this before, which is that I think that it's really important, you know, when we're looking at this from a defense perspective, when the jury makeup kind of has some sort of resonation with the client, which means that when we think about what's going on in his mind, there are certain experiences culturally and racially and, you know, just from different upbringings that can impact the way a person perceives what is a threat that's coming their way and how that threat can harm them. And so I think, again, Eric was just kind of touching on this, those background experiences, whatever reason he may have been carrying a knife, it may have just been for utility, but what would have been really helpful was to kind of understand more about his background. And it's just one of those things where the jury composition, when there is somebody who can relate on a cultural basis, it helps, you know, just shed some light when we talk about juries taking things from a common sense perspective. We always ask them to do it, but culturally, sometimes that's not common sense for everyone.
Eric Vettis, your thoughts on the jury makeup?
You know, look, if I was sitting there being charged with murder, the most serious crime there is, and the entire jury was a bunch of Chinese people, of course, nothing against them, but do they know what my life is like? Do they know, what could have been going on in my head? Are they even capable of seeing this in the way that I may have seen it in that moment? I think there'd be some serious doubts as to that, and I would feel rather insecure about that arrangement. And I bet Carmelo Anthony feels the same way when he looks into the eyes of the folks sitting in that panel who will decide his fate and argue. There's an argument that those folks do not know what his world is like. And that would be deeply concerning to me if I was Carmelo Anthony.
Claudia King, your thoughts on jury makeup?
Yeah, I think it is a bit troubling, and we just have to rely on our system that we have here, and that to understand a jury of our peers doesn't necessarily mean a jury panel that looks just like us. It just means a group of people in that area that ideally can look at the facts of the case and look at the law and decide the case based on those things. But to what Joanna and Eric said, we could have answered some of these questions by Carmelo testifying. I do understand why he didn't. Testifying is very scary, but I think that could have answered a lot of questions for the jury.
All right, my power panel for the evening. I really appreciate all of you. Joanna Nieves, Eric Faddis, and Claudia King, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your night. We may check in with you tomorrow on this case as the jury gets it. That's going to do it for court today. Thanks for being with me. Have a great night. But first, be sure to check out my new YouTube show called Justice with Matt Johnson. Tonight's episode, another deep dive in the Mackenzie Sherilla case and her parents and their many interviews. We have an expert who dives into what they may be sharing.